All right. Hi, everyone. I know we're still letting people in, but we have a wonderful presentation in front of us from Stacy, and I know it is a complex topic, so we want to give it as much time as possible and also make sure to leave time for questions. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us for this webinar on developing a budget, specifically developing a budget related to grants. My name is Micah Wallison. I am a member of the Green Lights Grant Initiative team. We operate with the Just Keep Living Foundation, Camilla and Matthew McConaughey's foundation. And we're really thrilled to help school districts across the country learn more about the grant making process, grant writing process, and gather the skills needed in order to successfully apply for and access federal school safety funds. This, like I said, is a very complex topic, so we're really lucky to have a wonderful expert here with us. I do just want to share that these slides, as well as the recording, will be shared with everyone who registered for the event. And if at any point you, in the next couple of days, have not received the slides and video recording, you can email us at info@greenlightsgrantinitiative, and we will be able to share that with you. That same email is also at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to quickly turn it over to share a message from Matthew McConaughey that he recorded for you all, and then we'll get going.
Hey everybody, McConaughey here with the Green Lights Grant Initiative. I want to welcome you to the How to Build a Grant Budget webinar. It's our last webinar of 2023, and today's webinar will walk you through the requirements of a typical federal grant budget, including general budget rules, resources, budget categories, and how to justify your budget and best practices for a strong budget. I want to thank you for joining this webinar and all of our previous webinars. We hope you've learned a lot along the way, and we can't wait to give you all more resources in the new year. Let's keep this going. Thank you for joining, and thank you for continuing to join. As always, in the meantime and all times, just keep living. Appreciate it.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. And my name is Stacy Rubel, and I will be your facilitator for this class. Just a little bit about me. I've been writing and reviewing federal, state, and foundation grants since 1995, and I started my own grant consulting business in 2011. I specifically specialize in federal grants, so you're in good hands here, and specifically in justice, human services, and mental health fields. Previously, I served as the VSTOP grant administrator for the Commonwealth of Virginia and as a grants manager and writer for 2 statewide nonprofits. And they currently hold the grant professional credential from the National Grant Professional Certification Institute. Next slide. So what we're going to cover today is what is a budget, terms that we're going to use, how to prepare, what are the various budget categories, and then how to write those budget categories. How do I know if something is allowable? How will my budget be reviewed? And what are common missteps in a budget? Next slide. All right, so first off, when we talk about what is a budget, it's not just the numbers, like I gave you an example on the left, it's also a justification, so a narrative. So you see on the left, we talk about personnel of 1 full-time equivalent, 1.0 FTE. And then on the right, we have LEA will hire 1 full-time project director, PD, to oversee the Stop Violence Now project in Happy Town. The PD salary is in line with other salaries of employees with similar duties and management level. The PD will oversee the day-to-day operations of the project. These duties will include working with the subgrantee. We train all to provide school violence prevention training to school personnel and administrators, supervising the staff of the project, completing required reporting forms, and being the point person for OJP. And so when I go through the different budget categories, I'll talk more about how to write those justifications. This just gives you a quick example. Next slide. Okay, terms that we are going to use in this class. And so these are just kind of brief definitions. I give you a couple of links there at the top, either in the funder guides that we'll talk more about shortly, Or there's also something called the Uniform Guidance, which is at 2 CFR 200. And then I gave you a link to that you can also copy and paste into your favorite web browser. So some of the acronyms and words that we're going to be using is NOFO, which is the Notice of Funding Opportunity. It could also be called an RFP, a request for proposals, an RFA, request for applications, a FOA, funding opportunity announcement, or a NOFA, notice of funding availability. So basically this means the solicitation for applications. This is what we call what the funder puts out and says, hey, we have money, come and get it. Another word that you'll hear me use is indirect costs. These are your overhead costs. So the cost of keeping the doors open. And we'll talk more about that later in the class. There's also a concept of a subawardee or a subgrant. This is when you as the recipient would receive funds and then pass them through to another entity to do the substantive work on the project. And we'll talk more about that. On the other hand, a contractor is an entity that receives money from a recipient to provide goods or services for that recipient's own use. So the subgrantee would be helping out your beneficiaries. A contractor is helping you. There's also the concept of match, which is also called cost share. The grants that you're going to be applying for, in what I've seen so far, do not require match, but just in case, this would be your share of the project cost. So like if it's a 10% match and it's a $100,000 grant, just to make the math easy, the federal government would give you $90,000, you would put in $10,000 in kind or cash. And then the last up is the SF 424 or the SF 424A. SF stands for standard form. And these are the SF 424 is the standard forms for the grant cover page and the budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do you prepare for the budget writing? You take a class like this, and then we have a couple of other resources that you can access. Next slide. Okay, so this is going to depend on the funder and what they have available, but these are just some tips. So obviously the first thing you're going to want to look at is the actual notice of funding opportunity. Then if the funder has them, you want to look in the NOFO to see, do they have a pre-application webinar or training? This is where they'll typically go through the notice of funding opportunity and take questions. I highly recommend, if they have something like that, to participate. There's some grants I've been writing every year for years, and I still participate in those webinars just to make sure something hasn't changed. If somebody else asks a question that I hadn't thought of, things like that. Frequently asked questions, see if those are posted either in grants.gov or on the funder website. They may have samples or templates that you can use. A lot of funders have policy or some sort of financial guide that you can use to access. There's also what we call freedom of information request. And so this is something that McAllister and Quinn also offers, but this is when you can go ahead and request a successful application from a funder in order to see what a good one looks like. Obviously, you also have the Green Lights Grant Initiative resources, and then I already previously mentioned the Uniform Guidance, which is under the 2 CFR 200, and that stands for Code of Federal Regulations. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to give you a couple of examples of what you're looking for. So this is specifically from the Stop School Violence Program fiscal year 2023 NOFO. And in part of it, you can see it's all the way down on page 22 of the guide of the NOFO, where it talks about budget and associated documentation. So, and I highlighted a couple of things in here. One is that you have to budget travel or lodging expenses for one visit to the Washington, D.C. area. They also talk about allowable costs. And then in that same spot, they talk about unallowable costs like trinkets. They reference the DOJ grants financial guide, which gives you a tip. That's something you want to look for. And then that last paragraph, they talk about the difference between a subaward and a procurement contract, because those relationships are going to be treated very differently. So you need to make sure you're picking the right one. And so with Department of Justice, they actually define those terms for you. Next slide. This is another example. This is from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is potentially one of the grants that you might apply for. They have a budget template that they provide to you that you can use to be able to provide your budget and budget justification to them. Even if you don't actually use their actual template, I highly recommend that you use the format of it. So, like where it has federal request personnel, that you actually put in, here's the position, here's the name of the person, and that could be TBD. For SAMHSA, it's like yes or no, are they key personnel? What's the annual salaried rate, level of effort? That's going to be on a federal no, FTE. So that could be 1.0, it could be 0.50, and then you have personnel cost, and FTE stands for full-time equivalent. Next slide. Remember I talked about the SF424A? This is what that form looks like, and you can see SAMHSA has actually put out a sample for you to tell you how to fill that out, which can be very helpful because sometimes these forms can be a little confusing and not necessarily user-friendly or intuitive. But they're not that complicated, and we'll be here to help you. Next slide. And this is just an example of the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. I know it says 2022, but you can see they also say it was last updated in 2023. I don't know why they didn't just change the title of it to 2023. They didn't ask me. So you can see some of the topics that they have in there, and specifically when you're writing a budget, looking at those allowable and unallowable costs. And then you'll specifically see they also talk about conference costs. And so if you're going to plan on having a training or a conference, that's something you definitely want to look at because they're pretty specific on what's allowable and what isn't allowable in that section of the guide. Next slide. Okay, so what are some maybe internal resources and information that you have at your ready for you? And this will depend on your LEA. You want to figure out who the numbers person is. They're going to be the one who can help you with like fringe benefit rates, if you have an indirect cost rate agreement, things like that, salary ranges, and then also have your own policies at hand so that you know, like, what are your travel guidelines? Do you use the General Services Administration or GSA rates, or do you have your own local rates, or do you use a state rate? What is your fringe benefit rate? Like I just mentioned, your indirect cost rate. What are your procurement policies? That also could come in handy for you. Next slide. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about the various budget categories. Okay, so this is from the SF424, and this is also how it's listed in Just Grants, which is the system that DOJ or Department of Justice uses. You'll notice we also love to use a lot of acronyms. I'm trying to remember to spell them out for you, but if you want to, you can put those kind of questions in the Q&A. And just as a reminder, you will get these slides and this webinar after this event. Okay, so those categories are personnel, fringe, travel, and then equipment. Equipment can be a little tricky. So equipment is any item, singular item, that is over $5,000. And you'll see I have currently over, the Office of Management and Budget are currently in the process of revising the uniform guidance. And one of the things they're looking at is increasing the equipment threshold from 5,000 to 10,000. And so if you're just asking for laptops, those are going to be supplies because they're not worth over $5,000 for each laptop. Then we have supplies. So those are going to be any items that are worth less than $5,000. Construction, which generally speaking is just going to be unallowable for the types of projects that you're going to be applying for. Subawards, procurement contracts, other costs, and indirect costs. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through each of these, although I did skip equipment because there probably isn't equipment that you're going to be purchasing that's over $5,000. And what I've provided to you is examples of the kind of items that you might ask for and how to justify them. Next slide. But first, a quick disclaimer. I made up this sample budget and budget narrative. So the figures in them are arbitrary. They may not necessarily reflect true costs. And particularly when we get to contract, really, that's true. I just literally made up the number. This is more for you to get a sense of how to write a budget and a budget narrative. And you want to make sure that your budget narrative is as specific to your project and your LEA as possible and have as much detail as you can provide. Next slide. All right, so let's start off with personnel. So these are going to be only for staff for the project that are directly employed by the applicant. So if you have like a consultant to the project, they are not considered personnel. They're going to be considered to be a contract. You need to make sure it's broken out for each staff person. You can't just say $300,000 for personnel. You have to break it down for each person. Then for each position, you're going to include the title, the name of the person if you have it. And like I said before, if you don't, you can just write to be hired or TBD. You want to indicate either what their annual, monthly, or hourly salary is, depending on how they are typically paid. The time frame. So typically that's going to be within a year, and level of effort. As I said before, that's full-time equivalent. So if somebody is full-time, that's going to be 1.0. If someone is part-time, say 20 hours a week, that's going to be 0.50 FTE. As I mentioned, and when we showed you the example of SAMHSA, some funders will identify who the key personnel are in the NOFO, and you might think, well, why is that important? I'm not going to get too in the weeds for you, but there's something called a prior approval that you would have to get if those key personnel change. Then for the narrative justification, you're going to want to point out that the salary is commensurate with other salaries. So, as I pointed out with the first example I gave, that is in line with other positions doing similar duties and similar management or supervisory duties. You're going to want to note if there's any sort of cost of living or merit increase that could occur, particularly when it's a multi-year grant, like the ones you're going to be applying for likely, and a brief description of their duties and needed expertise. In general, this justification needs to justify the level of effort and the amount of the salary. Next slide. Okay, so you'll be happy to hear I'm not going to read all of this to you because that would just be boring for you all, and that's why I wanted to give it to you as an example. But I do want to point out a couple of things. So you see what I did? This is a 2-year grant, and you'll note for the project director, which is a new hire position, that the salary for year 1 is adjusted to allow for approximately 2 months of hiring time. Now, that's not required that you do that, but I tend to do that personally in my own budgets so that I'm indicating I know that I'm not going to be able to hire somebody right off the bat. But some people like to go ahead and ask for the full year, and that way they might have some extra money that they'll be able to move around within the personnel or to another category. And you'll note here that we have that they are going to be at 1.0 FTE, the project director, and there is a 2% COLA increase, that's cost of living increase. So that's in year 2 for both positions. And then you'll see the training coordinator is an existing position. And so, but they're going to be only at 0.50 FTE. Now, you'll notice under the training coordinator position, I note that this person is already working 0.50 full-time equivalent as a trainer, and then this job will take them to full-time. The reason that I note that is because part-time positions can be hard to keep people in. They have higher turnover rate. So I wanted to point out to the reviewers that this person would end up being full-time, so likely you wouldn't have that same issue of high turnover. And then you'll also see I cross-reference in under the project director with the attachment C, which is where job descriptions would be in this hypothetical grant application. You'd have to look again in the NOFO to see if that's something that they're going to require. Next slide. Okay, so let's move over to fringe. So fringe is going to be just for the staff in the personnel section, and it's going to match the level of effort included in the personnel. So like with the training coordinator, if the training coordinator is at 0.50 FTE, you're only going to request 50% of their fringe. The fringe section should include FICA and other taxes, if not included in the fringe benefit rate. Then you're going to need to list out what's included in the fringe. So for example, retirement, and then with retirement, how long a staff person needs to be employed before they earn retirement and what rate that retirement is. And then what else is included in fringe? Health, dental, short-term disability, etc. And then the narrative justification just simply needs to include what's included in the fringe rate. You're typically not going to need extensive detail for this particular budget category. Next slide. Okay, so we have a personnel total salary was $193,520. So for fringe benefits, we times that times 32%, which is the fringe rate. So total fringe is going to be 65,286 for the 2 years. Then retirement is just year 2, which that salary is for just year 2 for the 2 positions is 103,020. And then that is 3% for the retirement. And both of those positions would be eligible to get retirement because it's only full-time positions at the LEA for 1 year. Next slide. Okay, travel. This is where, and I mentioned before, where you're going to want to make sure you're clear on what your own travel policy is. So do you follow your own travel policies, state rates, or the federal GSA rates? And also just to keep in mind, like with the GSA rate, which is a lot of times what folks use, you may not be able to use that like at a hotel if you're not a government employee. That same thing can happen with a state government rate. Like there's another firm that I conduct training for, and we have to only use the GSA rate, but I'm not a government employee. So I have had problems at a hotel that because I couldn't show them a government ID, I couldn't get the GSA rate. So that's just something to keep in mind. This section is only for travel for the staff of the applicant, not for any subaward staff or for any consultants that you hire. You're going to want to break down your narrative justification, and you're going to see in the next slide in a second what is included in the travel request, and then break down basically the who, what, where, why, and how. Who's going? Why are they going there? Where are they going? How are they getting there? And an estimated time frame if possible. So like if you know you're going to a specific conference, it's always in November, you could say November, and that's why we picked these particular GSA rates. There needs to be a direct link between the project and the travel being requested. So if you're requesting conference travel, then that conference needs to be specifically related to the topic of like school violence prevention. And as I noted before, you remember that some funders are going to require travel to certain trainings. So I copied and pasted this from the NOFO, from the Stop Violence Prevention NOFO, where they specifically said you need to have travel and lodging expenses for one visit to Washington, D.C. And this is expected, this meeting would be for a minimum of 2 days and 1 night for at least one person from the project. Additional folks may attend with a maximum of 3. So the information I can glean from that is one visit, DC, minimum 2 days, 1 night. I have to send at least one person. I can't send any more than 3. Next slide. So you'll see with the budget, it really, really has to be detailed. So they have to be able to show hotel, airfare, per diem, airport. In this example, I have them parking at the airport. You could also, and then I have mileage to and from the airport, And then in DC, they're doing ground transportation. So I came up with $30 for Metro, and that would be for one trip. You'll see I say we're going to send two people, and then all the calculations for each of those. And when you're doing these kind of calculations, you want to double check your math multiple times. I sometimes will still find math errors after I think I've checked it multiple times. You might also want to include local travel within your school district or LEA, because if you're traveling, if your project director is going to be traveling around to individual different schools, that could add up to a lot of miles depending on the size of your district. And so you may want to have that money budgeted so you're not eating that. And then I also included travel to one conference, because if you're going to go to a conference, chances are you're going to have to travel there unless it's local. So again, we have hotel, airfare, per diem, parking, and mileage to and from the airport. You'll notice with the per diem, and this would have to be based on your own travel policy, but typically if you're following the GSA rate, it's going to be different for the travel days than it is going to be for the non-travel days. So check your own travel policy to see whether or not that is true for your policy. Next slide, please. Okay, so you'll notice here I have the project director and the training coordinator going to the trip to DC. I've said I note that we're using the GSA rates and our own travel policies. We based it on the highest GSA rate since we didn't know what type of year the event will be, plus 25% tax. Sometimes people don't think of adding in that tax, and when you add in 25%, that can add up. I had our hypothetical place being like, I imagine them being in like Arizona or New Mexico. So they budgeted one more night in DC to enable traveling without needing to fly overnight. I cite the section of the uniform guidance that talks about the flying allowability for different kinds of airfare, but it also allows for the fact that you don't have to go with the absolute cheapest airfare if it's going to be a very circuitous route or it's going to require to fly overnight. So it is reasonable. And then the mileage to and from the airport, I had to guess because we have one person that is not HireJet. So I say that we use the current training coordinator's distance to the airport and then an estimated distance of 29 miles, which is from the county seat to the airport. Let's see. And then the local mileage, I explain why we're requesting local mileage and what sort of things are going to be happening at the individual schools. I also explain why that starts out day one, since the training coordinator in this hypothetical situation is going to start doing the school threat assessments and doing assessments for training from day one. And as I talk about here, our own travel policy, the per diem is not provided with local travel. So again, that's something that you would want to check your own travel policy. Then the last paragraph, I talk about wanting to go to a conference with BJA prior approval. Now, the reason I say with BJA prior approval, that's Bureau of Justice Assistance, is because BJA and a lot of DOJ grants will say, we'll pay for you to attend our trainings, but if you're going to attend a different training that's not one of ours, then you're going to have to get prior approval before you're allowed to spend the money and will be reimbursed for those costs. So I just note that they're choosing a conference that's closer to the hypothetical Happy Town, and they'll stay at the conference hotel. And I just completely made up these two organizations saying that they're looking at conferences putting on by Prevent Violence USA or Safe Schools for You. Next slide. Okay, like I said, I skipped equipment because chances are you're not going to be purchasing equipment. So supplies are going to be things that are less than $5,000. As I mentioned, that could go up to $10,000. This is a per item cost, not an aggregate. So if you're buying five $1,000 laptops, that is still a supply. Narrative simply needs to show how you attained your figures, Typically, you can say they're based on current usage or quotes that you've received for the costs. Next slide. So in this hypothetical example, we only have 2 lines for supplies. You could have other supplies that you require, but just for the simplicity of this particular class, I just gave you 2. So 2 laptops, 1 for the new position, and then I justify the new one for the existing position, saying she has a desktop computer, which is older, and she needs a laptop so it can travel with her, and that we did online quotes from office supply stores. For the office supplies, first off, you want to make sure if you do have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement for your LEA, make sure that office supplies are not already included in that, because a lot of times that is considered to be an overhead cost, and you don't want to be what we call double dipping and charging something both as a direct cost and as an indirect cost. Office supplies could include things like paper, pens, ink cartridges, etc. And we're saying based on current usage, that would be about $15 a month for projects of this size. You do not need to itemize, here's how many pieces of paper, here's how many pens, here's how many ink cartridges. I was reviewing Grant once a few years ago where they actually did break it down by the pieces of paper and the pens, and it was just too much detail. You don't need to do that. Next slide. Okay, so subaward. As I mentioned before, the DOJ grants financial guide actually describes this and defines it. And it says the substance of the activity that has been contracted or subawarded will be the major factor to be considered to determine if an entity being paid by a recipient is a subrecipient or a contractor. If program activities are delegated to another entity, that delegation will generally be considered to be a subaward. If the goods or services are purchased or procured from another entity for the non-federal entity's own use, or the recipient in this case, that activity will generally be considered to be a contract. So if someone's doing substantive work on the project for you, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute, they would be a subawardee. If you're unsure, ask the funder for assistance between the subaward and contract. And there also is more guidance in the uniform guidance. It's section 200.330. The narrative for the subaward should give a brief description of the qualifications of the subawardee and essentially provide a mini budget for the subawardee, including hourly or project rates and any associated supplies or travel. And I do see that we're getting some questions in. We'll go through all the questions at the very end, so please keep them coming. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so we have a hypothetical subawardee called We Train You. They're only asking for mileage and for the amount of trainings that they're going to do. And I describe who We Train You is, what sort of things that they do, how long they've been doing it to justify, this is why we picked them. You may have more detail here for why you picked a particular subawardee. And you can then, and I cite a memorandum of understanding that was created in attachment E. If you have not determined, well, and I'll show you this as an example when we get to contract. So I'll hold that thought. And then you've budgeted for them to provide for 2 trainings per month over 22 months of the 24-month grant period. Because remember, we're hiring a project director. We got to plan and schedule the trainings. So they're not going to be starting doing trainings right off the bat, because the training coordinator is also going to be doing assessments of what trainings are needed. And so I cross-reference to the project timeline. And again, talk about their hourly rate is commensurate with the rates that they charge other LEAs our size. And they're also requesting mileage. And I don't need to go into a whole lot of details on the mileage. You could go into a little more detail if you wanted to. You could say, 45 miles is the average distance between the headquarters or We Train You headquarters and each of the schools. And the 0.655 is we're reimbursing them on using our own travel policy. Next slide. So on the flip side of a subaward, you have procurement contracts. So these are going to be for entities that are providing a good or service that benefits the recipient. So this could be website developers, anonymous reporting systems, training registration platform. And then the narrative should briefly touch on what your procurement process is, which is why I noted that you would want to be familiar with whatever it is and which method is being used. So there's things called micro purchase, small purchase. Are you going to go through an RFP process? If an entity has already been chosen, note what sort of procurement process you went through to pick them, and then identify their qualifications and why they're needed for the project. Next slide. So, and this is the example where I literally just made up this number. I have no idea how much anonymous reporting system would cost. And when I tried to do a search for it, on all of them, I would have had to talk to a marketing person, and I didn't want to get stuck in that loop. So completely made this up. So, and in this case, they've not actually chosen who the contract is going to go to. So instead, they describe what they've gone through so far and what procurement policy they're going to go through to make a final decision. So similarly, you could say for a subaward, you've not picked a subaward, but you're going to go through a certain process to pick them. It would not be your procurement policy because subawards are not contracts, but you could say, you know, we have not yet chosen the subawardee. We are going to do a NOFO, notice of funding opportunity, and have subawardees apply to us, and then we will pick them going through a peer review process or whatever your process might be. Chances are the subawardees you would have picked ahead of time, but you may not have picked your contracts. So in this case, they're doing anonymous reporting systems. They've gotten 2 quotes. Their own procurement policy indicates that this would be called what we call a small purchase. And according to their procurement policy, it requires 3 quotes, not a full request for proposals. The $22.50 was an average price. They're going to continue researching to determine which system they're going to use based on costs and capabilities upon receipt if funded. So that first section describes how they're going to pick and how they came up with the number. Then the second part of this narrative talks about why an ARS is needed at all. Again, this could probably be more fleshed out for your individual LEA, but some examples of things you could say is we don't currently have one. It's a key component of a healthy and safe school environment. Teachers and parents have been asking for it, and here's why they're asking for it. I feel like there was something else I was going to say about that. Let me see. What else was I going to say? Oh, I know. And also, you may not have time to go through a whole procurement process or to get a bunch of quotes and to look at capabilities, and that's fine. Sometimes if I've looked at a couple of specific examples, I will actually list them. I might say, and I've gotten 2 quotes, one from XYZ and one from ABC, and indicate them so that the reviewers can see I have done my research and I am using evidence-based practices or contracts. Next slide. Now, other costs is for anything that didn't fit anywhere else. So this is kind of your catch-all. So if you have any sort of overhead costs that are not already included in your negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, which is also called a NICRA, those are going to typically go here. And then there could be other things that might go here. So rent, postage, and utilities, a lot of times is going to be in an indirect cost rate, but if it isn't, you could include that here. Printed materials, subscriptions, training registrations, all of those would go under other costs. And then the narrative should identify each cost, provide a justification for it. I specifically note, like, if there's a cost that could be considered to be an overhead cost, I explain that those are not currently in our indirect cost rate agreement. And if I don't have a NICRA, I would note that as well. Again, you just need to provide sufficient detail to the cost to make sure you're justifying why you need them. Next slide. Okay, so again, I kept it simple. I just have training registration and public awareness materials. The training registrations go into a little bit more detail about why they want to attend a training registration. If you know specifically what conference you want to attend, I would include, here's the conference that we want to attend or a conference similar to it. And then you could actually say, in year 2023, this was their theme. These are some of the workshops. That way, if the reviewers are not familiar with that particular entity who's putting on the conference, you can show you've done your research and you can prove this is why this would be a good investment for them to attend that training. And then for the public awareness materials, you can say internally design the brochures and then externally have them professionally printed. And the cost is based on other similar costs that we've had for other projects. Next slide. And then indirect costs, I could spend an entire workshop just on this, so I'm going to give you just enough to make you dangerous. These are the costs that keep the doors open. You might also hear them referred to as overhead or facilities and administrative costs, F&A. Some examples: rent, utilities, janitorial services, administrative staff, payroll, accounting, human resources, etc. And the reason that these are indirect costs is like it's impossible to be able to allocate them to each separate grant. And so that's why they're considered to be overhead costs, and it'll allow recipients to recoup those costs in a fair way. So the federal government allows recipients to either get a negotiated rate or use what we call a de minimis rate of 10% on modified total direct cost. And like I said, I'm not going to go too in the weeds with that. Talk to your finance department to figure out if you do have a NICRA or if you can use the 10%. And if the changes to the uniform guidance go through, that could be moved up to 15%. Next slide. Okay, so those are all the categories and gave you a little bit of information on the kinds of things you might ask for and how to do your narrative. So I'm going to cover a couple of more topics and then we'll go to Q&A. So how do I even know if the things I'm asking for are allowable? Next slide. So there's 4 basic questions to ask yourself. Is it allowable? So that has to be in accordance with what we call the cost principles and not be outright disallowed by the funder. Cost principles are part of the uniform guidance, which again is the rule book that all federal grants follow. If something is outright disallowed, like food at conferences or construction, this information would be in the NOFO or in the funder's financial or policy guide. It needs to be what we call allocable. So be in proportional benefit to the grant. Like the training coordinator, they're only going to spend 20 hours per week on this project. So 0.50 or 20 hours per week is charged to this grant. It also needs to be reasonable. We call this the prudent person test. Is the price for the item reasonable for the project, where you're located, what the project is, how sophisticated the project is, and is it based on the necessity of the item? And is it necessary? That's where that budget justification comes in. It has to be justified as needed for the project. Next slide. All right. So how is my budget going to be reviewed? So once, as I affectionately call it, you hit the big red button and then you submit your grant. What happens after that? Next slide. So your typical grant review process is going to be an initial screening where if you submitted it late or you don't have all the information that you needed or you're not eligible, that's where they're going to not review you. They'll pull you out. Typically, you'll be fine, make it through initial screening. Then it's going to go through what we call a peer review. So typically this is when peers or types of people who would be peers of like who would be hired to be your project director. So this could be folks from school districts who have worked in the school violence prevention field. This could be researchers who've worked in the field, previous professionals who've worked in the field. They're going to review your application on technicalities. So does your work plan make sense? And if you attended the workshop on the writing a grant in general, we talked about the narrative, the work plan. Does the timeline make sense? Does it seem like you have the qualifications in order to carry out the project? Then there's something called a pre-award risk assessment. This is when the funder looks at whether or not you have the capacity to pull the project off, or if there's any sort of risk associated with you. And if there is risk, then they may still fund you, but put what we call special conditions on your grant. And then they're also going to do a cost analysis and systems review. So cost analysis means they're going to look at each individual cost to determine, okay, is that reasonable? So like the anonymous reporting system, they might also do a search to see, okay, how much do ARSs typically cost? Is what they're asking for reasonable? Something to keep in mind is different people are going to be reviewing your project narrative and budget. So when they're going through the pre-award risk assessment and the cost analysis, those folks doing that may not also be reviewing your project narrative. So your budget narrative needs to be able to stand on its own. Next slide. I'm not going to read this to you, but again, this just gives you an example of the financial analysis that DOJ is going to go through. So they're going to do a cost analysis, do cost breakdowns, review indirect cost, look at your accounting system. They may ask for an additional financial review, make sure that you don't have any federal debt. So those are the kinds of things that they're going to be looking at. And I know DOJ specifically has 2 questionnaires that you would have to complete in order to apply for their grants. Next slide. All right, so last up, what are some common budget missteps? Next slide. Okay, so here are some common problems that you want to make sure you don't have. So you could have a situation where you have one person or one team is writing the project narrative and another team is writing the budget. You want to make sure those two are in alignment. I've had situations where it's exactly that. I'm working with the writer or the subject matter expert and I'm writing the proposal and somebody else is working on the budget. Let's say the budget people decide, well, we don't really need 3 people. We only need 2 people. But throughout the grant narrative, I'm talking about 3 people. That's not going to jive. You want to make sure that if there's any changes to the project narrative, that is then reflected in the budget and vice versa. Mathematical errors and associated with that is like you change what the salary is or the level of FTEs, but then you forget to change the fringe and other related costs. Making sure that you don't put supplies in equipment. Lacking adequate justification. If you can't justify it, chances are they're not going to pay for it. Similarly, not having enough detail in figures. I see a lot of times where folks have travel and they'll just say, we're budgeting $10,000 in travel to attend the BJA required trip to DC. That's not going to fly. They want it broken down. If in your justification and your figures, a funder cannot tell if the cost is allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary. Let's say your totals don't match, like totals in one section don't match the final totals, or your totals on your SF424A don't match your narrative. You want to make sure all of those align. And then, as I mentioned before, double dipping with indirect costs. Next slide, it should be the question slide. Yes. So that's it for the presentation and just about right on time. We said we'd spend about an hour doing that. And then Tori, if you can go through the questions for me and let's see if I can give you some answers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Stacy. As Stacy mentioned, please continue to put your questions into the Q&A function and we can answer them at this time. Or if we do not get to your question today, please feel free to email the Green Lights Grant Initiative email with some follow-up questions. So our first question here from an attendee is, can you discuss examples of what would be considered disallowed construction? For example, would the build out of a dedicated room for central camera monitoring be considered construction?
Yes, that would be considered to be construction. So you'd want to carefully review the NOFO to see if that kind of construction would be allowed. But that would be considered, typically that would be considered to be construction. Yes.
Great. Our next question here is a grant writer and administrator included in overhead costs?
Yes, typically that's where they're going to have to be, because a grant writer like myself, I can't be put into a proposal, a grant narrative, because I'm sorry, budget narrative, because that's a what we call a pre-award cost. It's not a cost that's going to be during the period of performance. So yes, grant writers, grant administrators are typically going to be, well, they should be put into indirect costs.
Great. We have a process question. How soon in the grant development process do you recommend starting the budget?
I typically say kind of once you've fleshed out your general idea, then start then. So not necessarily starting them at the same time, but like I'm going to, after this training, I'm going to go and be on a conference call with a client. And so far, we haven't really talked budget, but they haven't really fleshed out what their idea is yet. And they're applying for the BJA grant when it comes out next year. But we have some ideas about what's allowed and what's not allowed. So actually today, during today's call, once they tell me, okay, we've come up with what our project goals are going to be, I'm going to start talking to them about budget.
Great, that's helpful. Another question here is, how do you know if office supplies is an overhead cost or not?
So what you want to do is you want to ask whoever your finance person is for your district if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. And if you do, it will be built in there and you would actually be able to read it, or you can ask them and have them check to see was that part of the indirect cost when it was negotiated or not. It will be in that document.
Great. Another question here is, can you explain again what it means to double dip with indirect costs?
Sure. So kind of going with what the office supplies were. So let's say in my indirect cost rate agreement, it specifically says office supplies, or it says rent or janitorial services or administrative staff. And that's in my indirect cost rate agreement. If I turn around and ask for that as a direct cost, I'm then getting money in my indirect cost and my direct cost for the same thing. That's considered to be double dipping. Now, but let's say the rent that I'm already paying for is my LEA, but let's say for some reason I needed to rent new space, maybe to conduct trainings in or something like that. That rent could be included as a direct cost, but then you would need to justify it and show that that's not already built into your indirect costs. This is additional rent above and beyond what you typically would pay.
Great. Another question here is there a limitation on the length of a budget justification?
Typically, no. You know, I honestly, I put as much detail as I possibly can in there. If it's a little long, I'd rather be a little long, and have them read through it and get lots of information than be too short. But you would need to check with the funder to see if they have limitations. In all the grants I've ever written, I can't remember one that there's been a limitation to the budget narrative.
Great. Another question is, where should non-applicant personnel travel be put into?
That would go into the consultant line item. So it depends. If it's for a subaward, then it goes in the subaward category. If it's in a contract, it would go in the contract category. So it just depends where that non-applicant staff position is. And then that's where that travel will go. Good question. I don't think I clarified that.
Great. So we have another question here that looks a little broader, but what are the metrics you would use to evaluate the possibility of a grant being approved? And also, I think it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the best budgets that you've seen.
The best budgets I've seen are clearly justified and clearly linked to the project narrative. I mean, when it comes to the budget, that's really what they're going to be looking for. When it comes to a project narrative, what I say is it needs to be written well so that you're conveying the ideas clearly and thoroughly, and it follows the rules, and that your project idea is sound. So those are the three things that's really going to make your grant more likely to be funded. And then specifically with your budget, like I said, justify, and then justify some more if you can, with specific quotes as much as you can, specific information as much as you can, and then making sure, you don't have any of those missteps that we talked about.
Great. You have another question here. How many hours does it take on average per grant to complete a budget?
Honestly, I've been writing grants so long, I don't know how long it would take. I can tell you to do this fake one. It took me probably 3 or 4 hours to come up with all the justification, to come up with the numbers, to double check my math. Well, yeah, I'd probably say 3 or 4 hours. But if you're brand new to it and you're having to find, real prices of things and having to investigate what your real policies are, I would say it would take more time than that. And plus, if you're new at it. So I would say just ballparking it somewhere between like maybe 6 to 10. And that's being generous, like maybe not that long.
Great. Another question here is, can you define per diem and how it's determined?
Sure. So per diem, sorry, I should have explained what that means. So per diem is going to be covering your food and incidentals like tips and things like that. So the example that I gave you in here was based on the General Services Administration, or the GSA rate. That's what the federal government uses. Your state might have another rate that you're using in other state level grants. So you'd want to check again with your travel policy to see what that per diem is. And that basically, school districts would use that so that you don't have to have folks who are attending trainings or traveling to have to keep receipts. It just makes it so it's cleaner. You've kind of maxed out, like you get $79 a day. If the person spends more than $79 a day, they have to eat those costs. It's not the school district that eats those costs. It also helps with not paying for alcohol.
Great, thanks, Stacy. We have another question here. This is a little bit more general, but can you request feedback on a federal grant that you were not awarded?
Yes, and I strongly recommend that you do that. So let's say you don't get funded. I would immediately then contact whoever the contact person is at that entity or at that funder and ask for that feedback. And they should be able to provide it to you in writing. If they say they don't have it available in writing, which I'm going to say that they probably do and they should. Like when I train feds, I tell them they need to have that written feedback, but I don't train all of them. So, and they may not listen to me, even if I do. Anyway, so even if they can't provide you with written comments, then I would ask to have a phone call. I would also say if you read the written comments and you're still like, I still don't get why I didn't get funded, set up a phone call with them before the solicitation comes out again. They're typically not going to talk to you and give you individualized feedback once the solicitation has come out.
Great. Another question here is, can you ask for past successful grant applications to review?
Yes, that's called what we call a FOIA request. So pretty much on the front page of most federal websites, if you scroll down to the bottom, it'll say FOIA office, that's Freedom of Information Act. And then you would send them a letter or see what kind of, they might have an online form that you fill out and be very specific. I want to see a successful application for the Stop Violence Prevention BJA FY23 competition. I would like it for a mid-sized school district, because you don't want, like, if you're in New York City, it doesn't help you to get one from a small district in Idaho or vice versa. So you want to say, in a rural school district or a small or medium or large school district in an urban location, so that it's close enough to your proposal and your area that you'll be able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Thank you. Our next question is, what should an applicant do if they experience a change in cost from pre-award to post-award?
Okay, it's a good question. So you typically with funders, they will allow you to move money around up to 10% without getting prior approval. There's some caveats to that, but typically that's what will be allowed. Again, you'd want to look in their financial guide to see if that's true. Like I know some offices don't allow you to move any around, some offices do. You want to check the financial guide and the NOFO. Or ask your funder, be like, hey, we need to move some money around. Do we need to ask for prior approval and see if you're not sure? Because you don't want to move it around and then have them disallow costs because then you have to pay that money back. And that's not good for anybody. So yeah. So sorry, I got a comment there and I was looking at it. So yeah. Anything else in there?
1 second, just looking through our questions here.
Sure. Yeah, and so just, oh, sorry, I didn't even think about this. So when you're looking at those FOIA applications, do not copy them. One, that's plagiarism. Two, you want to make sure that it's specific to that specific school district. I know I've offered FOIA applications to clients, and sometimes they'll use that as a starting point versus as just something to give them ideas. Think of it as if this is just giving me ideas and then create, and sometimes it's just formatting that you might like about a proposal and you can borrow that, but do not copy or be like, oh, I really like the way they worded this. Let me copy and paste that. That's still plagiarism, even if it comes from a FOIA proposal.
Thank you for that clarification. Another question here is, can you talk a little bit more about a negotiated indirect cost rate and how we should know that whether or not we have one and how to acquire one?
Sure. So somebody in your finance department will know if you have one. You just need to find that right person because the school district would have needed to negotiate that. So somebody negotiated that. So someone would know, particularly if you have other federal grants, which I'm, considering you likely do. Or even if you don't, if you have state grants that are federal dollars, you might also have a negotiated rate. To go about doing that, there's a couple different ways. If you don't have federal grants, all your grants come from the state, you might be able to negotiate a rate with the state. When I was doing some web searches about LEAs and indirect costs, a lot of the websites that I came up with were state websites that talked about how LEAs could negotiate with a state to get a negotiated rate. If you're going directly to the federal government, then you would go to your what we call your cognizant agency. And so your cognizant agency is going to be the agency that you get your most of your money from.
Great. Looking through some additional questions here, just 1 second.
Sure.
To follow up from that question, what should applicants expect to do if they do not have a negotiated indirect cost rate?
Then you definitely want to ask for the de minimis rate of 10%. That way you can still recoup some of your indirect costs, and you don't have to justify that. All you have to say is we're requesting the de minimis rate of 10% on what is called modified total direct costs. And then you'd want to look up in the uniform guidance what that definition is. It might also be in the NOFA where they talk about the de minimis rate as well.
And another follow-up to that is the de minimis rate typically 10% or can that vary?
No, it is 10%.
Okay, thank you. If there are any other questions, please do feel free to send those in. Otherwise, I think that concludes our question and answer. Again, please do feel free to send some questions in via email if we did not get to them or if you think of some later.
And thank you everyone for joining. This was our last webinar of 2023, but as we roll into the new year and hopefully have more information regarding how the government will be funded, we'll know more specifics about the times of when these grants come out. And that is a big part of what we do is share that information with you. If you've received emails about, our grants and how to, or our webinars and how to join them, then that means you're on our mailing list. If you feel like you got sent this and you haven't heard anything from us, please let us know at info@greenlightsgrantinitiative.org. But a big part of what we'll do come the new year, so we learn more about when grants become available, is be a huge resource to you in saying, this grant will be available in a week, or we know this grant just opened, and we know this is the deadline. We know that that is a huge kind of hole right now in how some grants get put out there. So that's a big part of what we do. And then in the new year, we'll also have some specialized grant webinars talking about specific grants that come from different departments. So be on the lookout for all that. And we really appreciate you guys taking the time to be here today. And then a final reminder that if you registered for this webinar, you will get sent out the slides as well as the recording as soon as possible. And then we'll have this information on our website accessible in the next couple of days. So thank you so much. And we can't wait to see you at our webinars in the new year as well.